Hey, my friends, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And a while back, we went through this phase as a family, well, as an extended family, where, my dad in particular, I'll just say it, but, maybe more of us as well, but particularly Dad was really in a cable news phase. And I don't know if you've ever heard of cable news, but it's this thing that happens on cable television. It gained popularity in the 1990s and then just took over cable television in the early 2000s. It's a place where talking heads talk about things. And there was even a claim for a while on one of these cable news stations. It was like new news every 15 minutes. And implicit in that was like whether it's real or not. And they just make stuff up every 15 minutes. So there would be new news. And so you understand how it is. These news stations, they're competing for attention. So naturally, the more bombastic stuff they say, the more likely people are to watch their channel and not somebody else's. Over the years, this has resulted in a news channel that orients toward the out-of-power team's political views, getting a lot of ratings because they can rail on and complain about whoever's in power, and then they go down when their team actually wins, and so on and so forth. This is probably not the healthiest thing for us, but accepting that maybe I'm not qualified to issue a judgment on the health of cable news for all of society, I know it wasn't a healthy thing for us as an extended family. And my mom felt the same way, and I think we all just felt like we needed a break from the toxicity of this conversation. And so we took a vacation one time to Breckenridge, Colorado, which is beautiful. Fly fishing, it's a ski area. You start at mountains that run up to the better part of 14,000 feet. It's quaint, it's beautiful. And we got this neat mountain chalet place to hang out. We were like, we want this to be fun. We want this to be a happy memory. So we're making a rule, no cable news while we're here. And we get up there and everybody's like, yeah, everybody's cool with it. Everybody wants it to be a good trip and a happy time. We don't want to poison it with that nonsense. But it wasn't too long and we discovered that, hey, we're going to take a break for this little agreed upon chunk of time from cable news. It wasn't very long until we figured out that it actually takes some rules to make that work. Because, what if nobody's in the room? Like, what if everybody else goes down to the pool, but Dad or maybe my brother-in-law just want to sit by themselves and watch cable news? Is that allowed or is it not? Well, we talked about it as a family. We're like, well, it's not allowed because if we're taking a break from this, you might skip time with family because you want to just sit and watch the cable news. So no, if it's off, it's off. Well, then a little later on, we had to work through, like, what about cable news, like little clips on YouTube or on your phone, just to get the highlights of what the really important talking heads have to say, and just to get like a little bit mad. Would that be okay? And ultimately we decided, no, that doesn't really work either. And then we had to work through the question of what if we go to a restaurant and cable news is on? Do we sit facing a different direction? Do we go to, it's a silly thing, right? It's just cable news. Who cares? But it became a thing when it took on a meaning. And it was like, hey, we're doing this because we want to nurture health. We want to nurture something beautiful with our family. We feel like we need this break from this type of conversation and this type of mindset. And then we discovered that our simple set of boundary rules just wasn't enough for this reason, and maybe a few others as well. I really am empathetic to the people who are portrayed as the bad guys in the Gospels. When you look through the book of Matthew, you have all of these Sabbath controversies, right? Now, what is the Sabbath? It's a thing that God established in the Ten Commandments as day of rest. It's this rhythmic, hardwired, baked-in time that is supposed to make us, you're just not doing much else, and you have a lot of time to think about God and reflect on God, because if you can't work, you can't do all this other stuff, what do you do at that time? If you're just sentenced, if you will, to sitting there quietly with people you love and thinking about things. You're either going to nurture a relationship with each other, or you're going to reflect on the important things about life and of God. I get it. It's God's idea, and I'm pro-God, so I get it. But in the New Testament, the people who are really excited about the Sabbath tend to come off looking pretty bad because they're excited about the Sabbath in some very picayunish ways. But in fairness to them, I think from the outside looking in, those ways can seem perhaps a bit more picayunish than they actually are, or you can understand why the rules, whether we might like them or not, evolved the way they did. If you set up a thing and you're like, all right, we're taking time off every seventh day, you just have got a chunk. You got this 24-hour window of thinky time where you are going to reflect on things, and it's going to be different from the rest of the week. Whatever you want to use it for is just going to be different from the rest of the week. We got this time coming up, and this time is not just about the health of the individual. Sure, as 21st century Westerners, and I assume that's most of who's sitting here in this conversation with me, we're going to view the Sabbath thing as an individual retreat, like a journaling time to go to the mountains, to the woods, and just kind of think about my feelings and just jot down some things that are maybe going through my mind right now. That's what we picture the Sabbath being about, but it wasn't that. Because whereas you and I are very much used to the one man, one woman, one vote kind of thing, their rugged individualism, there was a little bit more of a collectivist notion in place religiously, politically, philosophically in the world of the Old Testament and in Jesus' time in the early first century. And that's there because of that deal you remember that we've talked about so much, that deal between Moses and God, where God makes a conditional arrangement with Moses where he's like, look, I'm going to be your God, you're going to be my people, and if you obey me, I'm going to bless you. And then everybody all around is going to be like, whoa, look, they obeyed their God and their God blessed them. It's definitely got to be the real thing there. That's the real God, and they're the real chosen people. But if you disobey me, I'm going to punish you. And then everybody's going to say the same thing. The blessing, curse, whatever, that's up to you guys. Either way, everybody's going to know that I'm God and you're my people. And as we've talked about before, this deal, this covenant, the Mosaic covenant, is the narrative cipher for understanding all of the Old Testament. And it's also the behavioral cipher for decoding the extra biblical stuff that evolved along the way. Look, guys, it's not just about you. If you do stupid things as a Jewish countryman under the deal that Moses has with God, then we're all going to get punished. We can't screw around here. We'll lose at war. We'll have bad crops. God is making a point. He wants us to obey, and crazy supernatural stuff happens when we don't, and he spells it out like, look, we need to do the things God wants us to do. It's a matter of national import. Now, for you and me, we look at people saying that now, or we rightly roll our eyes at it. I don't think that deal applies. I don't think a lot of the reasoning that people use in like the United States when they're like, we need to say the F word less in our cable news television programming because when God hears that word, he punishes us as a nation. I just don't see it. You'd have to work really hard to make a biblical case for that, and I still think you'd lose. It just ain't in there, but it definitely is there in the Old Testament and under the covenant of the law made with Moses. So the Sabbath thing then, one, I get why they made all the extra rules because I get why we had to nail down extra rules to just come up with something that was fair and equitable and predictable for the no cable news week. It wasn't as simple as don't do it. We had to specify it and think about it, or else it was just going to be a rule that didn't make any sense, a thing that didn't make any sense to even have. But I also understand their impulse because I understand a little bit about the collective nature of this Mosaic covenant and how all of these people who viewed themselves as being part of God's chosen people would have been like, hey, obedience is something that raises us all up in our closeness with God collectively, and we can't have people messing around with that. And I realize at this point I haven't even read anything from the Bible yet, but there's Bible stuff here that we're going to talk about. So we're into Matthew chapter 12, and Matthew 12:1 says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Well, this is the big bazillion-dollar question that we have to tackle over the next couple of days here. Were they doing what was unlawful? And if they were doing unlawful, was that bad, or is the law screwed up? And what do we mean by law? Is this the law of God? Is this the bonus stuff? Is this the basic principle of, hey, no cable news this week? Or is this all the little bonus rules that had to go along with, hey, no cable news this week to make, hey, no cable news this week actually effectively work? And is breaking one of the bonus, hey, no cable news this week rules the same as violating the straight up, hey, no cable news this week rule? This is a lot more complicated question than I think sometimes the Christian lenses on text like this about the Sabbath controversies give it credit for being. So here's the game plan for the next couple of days. We've got this scenario that we just looked at that I'm going to break down a little bit more tomorrow. And then we have Jesus' response, a bunch of red letters. And he's going to go to a pair of Old Testament examples, and then he's going to make a gigantic declaration. So we're going to break this all out into little components in order to try to get to the heart of the meaning, the heart of what Jesus is driving at. And I think this is a very important question because it's another one of those places where we're trying to understand the relationship between Jesus, who is the main character of the New Testament, and everything that happened in the Old Testament. Is he just washing his hands of rules when it's convenient? Is he pushing back on something that doesn't have anything to do with God or the scriptures of the Old Testament? Getting these little details right help us understand exactly how all of the old stuff interacts with all of the new stuff. And, well, spoiler alert, I think it is all pulling in the same direction. But if we read this differently, we might arrive at the conclusion that the New Testament is pulling in one direction, while the Old Testament is pulling in a completely different direction. And tomorrow, I think we're going to have a really fun time because we're going to make an effort to try to understand the rules and regulations and social expectations that were bouncing around in the brains of the Pharisees when they complain at Jesus and the disciples. And we've actually got a ton of extra biblical primary source or very near to the time material of the kind of teachings that they would have been studying, that they would have memorized, that were outside the Bible, that you and I won't catch if we just read through the Bible. And so I think it's going to be really fun to go to that primary source as well to get inside the heads of the people who are irritated with Jesus and try to give them a fair shake as we understand what's going on in this passage. Okay, I understand this time around is just kind of a big setup thing, but I had fun talking about the cable news scenario, and hopefully it frames up the whole deal that we're going for here in a way that makes it more profitable over these next few conversations. As always, thanks to everybody who supports the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. And since I'm saying thank you for things, thanks also to everybody who's been reviewing the podcast. I read every single one of those. They are incredibly nice. And somebody who goes and reviews it after listening to this episode is going to be the 1,000th reviewer, which is a really big deal in the world of podcasting. It means that we're having a lot of conversing. 1,000 people reviewing a podcast. That's amazing. Thank you all for doing that. And thank you also for hanging out with me and talking about stuff like this from a long, long time ago that still has a whole lot of bearing on today. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.